I think one of the things that's interesting about Paths of Glory and maybe films like The Killing is that, as opposed to the later ones, they're very distilled. I think he always boiled his segments down, and it's not as if there's anything that feels unnecessary in the later films, but it really goes at a clip. It's very fast, people speak fast. The opening scene between the two generals, you can imagine in a later period taking a lot longer and being much more pregnant and having more space and I guess just time to it, whereas this rattles almost like a Lubitsch film in certain ways. Just people really speak fast. But in common with his other films, I think it shows how people can become brutalized by the circumstances they're in, and how even with declared principles or a kind of cerebral set of rules, that emotions undermine things ultimately. And I think that's even in the end why the end is so powerful, is that they're so set up to dislike this German girl coming out, played by his soon-to-be wife. But they can't help but recognize a humanity there and a common humanity. And I think when people say Kubrick isn't an emotional director, I think he's actually maybe one of the most emotional directors there's ever been, in that I think he's specifically interested in how powerful the emotions are. And I think his eye and his use of wide-angle lenses, which can feel distancing, is actually trying to see people struggle to exist in these very difficult circumstances. So it's a long-winded way of saying that it feels in continuity with his other films. It feels there's a similar voice, but the most memorable thing about this, I feel, is really just people struggling with an absurdity, struggling to make sense of something that is incomprehensible and beyond them. And I think that occurs in all of his films. Kubrick, I just think, has an incredibly keen eye for tension within any image. I mean, there's, for example, if you take Kirk Douglas in the court-martial scene, I can't think of any director who would play the bulk of that scene on a tracking wide shot behind the prisoners. I mean, most directors would go straight in. You would have a push in towards the orator at a key moment, and the distance of it, the hollowness of his voice, you know that this is going to fall on deaf ears. To stay that far away from that performance, I think, is the mark of a director who's focused purely on how can this work thematically and how can this tell the story best. He never seems seduced by anything frivolous. Everything's always necessary, and you always feel, well, that is the position that the camera should be in that is going to have the most varied impact. It's going to show the most and the most conflicting elements as well. And I think that's why his eye is so exciting. There's no one who puts the camera in a better place than Kubrick, I don't think. I mean, Kubrick, I think, is a brilliant actor's director. I mean, I don't know whether he would necessarily be a director that actors found easy to be directed by, in that it feels that he is interested in something being unusual, something that you haven't quite seen before. And I think a director like Altman probably did that by completely enfranchising the actors to do whatever they wanted. And it seems that Kubrick did it by giving so much time to the performance that almost through exhaustion, the actors would come up with something different, because you feel that he had such a cliche filter that those actors would have to just stop doing the rote thing. I don't think Kirk Douglas has really been better in anything than in this film. And he probably knew that in terms of trying to get Kubrick onto Spartacus. And he's great in Ace in the Hole, but there's still a lot of fizz in those films and shininess, whereas this is really cynical and angry. And I mean, there's often that Kubrick character who's the cynic in a world of madness, and I think Matthew Modine's character in Full Metal Jacket has a similar register to Kirk Douglas in this. It's a highly intelligent person who nevertheless can't get out of this situation, that they're resigned. They're not all of their cleverness. What does that do? You may as well almost be mad. That, you know, what freedom does your intellect give you in this kind of situation? But then you have the generals who could easily lapse into a kind of caricature or a cliche, but you never feel that they're dismissed, you never feel that they're not argued for. They feel nuanced, they're not mere fops. And you can see their side, I think, and you can see the argument for, well, how else do you run an army? How else do you marshal troops? How do you decide anything in a war which is just as brutal as that? I feel the performances are quite cohesive in a certain way, because they're all struggling to kind of make sense in their own way, and it depends which way they break. The generals have to keep a kind of decorum and a refinement and almost a show to them, whereas Kirk Douglas is in a more real environment, and the soldiers who are there, who don't straddle the two, seem on the brink of madness, really, that they just have that, I guess, Kubrickian 1,000-yard stare, which he's so fond of. And I don't know how deliberately, but there just is a certain half-lidded eye look that seems to exist in all Kubrick films. But somehow they mesh together. There's just, I don't know how he does it. And taking actors who clearly seem like they're from different worlds and different disciplines. But it's more that he seems to go for something that's more interesting rather than a kind of ummy-erry naturalistic register. So even actors who you feel could be more method or more Rod Steigerish aren't allowed to just drift around. They all seem very focused. I feel with Kubrick films, and I think this is no different, there are very rarely moments that feel extraneous or short scenes which are just a linking of narrative. They're almost play-like in that they really are large blocks and large units, and he seems to work like that. I couldn't really imagine Kubrick making a film like Altman, where he fell in love with something that an actor did and just wanted that in, or cutting between various strands. It feels more mythic than that, and larger building blocks. So I guess this film starts with that third-person narration that just sets the scene very quickly. He's not someone who's going to have lots of little scenes just to set something up in that way. And you're straight into the dilemma of it all. It almost reminded me of the start of The Shining, where it really is, this is the premise of the film. We need a new caretaker, the last one went mad. How do you feel about it? And it just lays it all out. Persona does the same thing, actually. And this just lays out the central dilemma. we need to take this position. It's completely arbitrary in a certain way because it's required for political reasons, for morale. The impossibility if it's declared. An inducement is offered in a very roundabout way, and then the general says, well, yes, let's see what we can do. And so the whole film feels like it's laid out in the first scene. And I think he often does that, and then it just plays out the consequences of that absurdity of someone being hubristic about their ability to overcome something. And I think Clockwork Orange is that as well. You know, we can take this criminal and we can reform them. The Shining is, there's something deeply strange about this place, but this person feels that they can handle it and it actually will be an opportunity. Yes, or Eyes Wide Shut is someone who kind of feels overconfident in a marriage, that somehow they know all of the secrets of their partner and that they are beyond those kinds of temptations and predilections. And I think he's good at taking a human vanity and just unravelling it. And I guess there's no bigger absurdity than war, that it's something that can be won and that something by conviction can be done. And, you know, structurally it's very interesting. You never see the enemy. You know, he denies you really the idea that there is this other group of people who can be, I don't know, set against you, that really it's almost presented as an internal struggle within an army. And similarly, I think Full Metal Jacket does that. You very rarely see the opposition. It's about, I guess, people justifying how they can do something that's unjustifiable. I mean, Kubrick's obviously someone who later produced his own films. I guess this is still a James Harris production, but he was, as he went on, he became more and more the complete overseer of his films. And maybe that's why they took so long, because of just setting everything up himself. But I think he's interested in moments of great tension and, I guess, things that are incommensurate. And war is, I suppose, the ultimate point of non-negotiability. And I guess, you know, if you count Fear and Desire as well, they're 4 of his films, and he didn't make many, are war films. And most of his films have some form of violence in, some kind of situation whereby there's a break in decorum, that it gets down to life or death. And how he handles those scenes is, yeah, very interesting. I mean, but in a way, the great violence that is done, or the things that feel most violent, aren't necessarily the trench warfare or that attack, but really just the absolute coldness of the execution. I mean, that's the most violent act in the film. And the courtroom scene is brutal and feels so emotionally draining in a way that the infantry fighting just feels mechanistic and just depressingly pointless and awful and ungoverned and random. Whether this person gets blown up versus this person just feels so terrible and chaotic, as opposed to the clinical, measured, inexorability of the execution of their own soldiers. And so, you know, that's such an interesting juxtaposition within the film as well, and how he can, you think of in 2001 the disassembling of the computer of Hal, and just the brutality of it is so memorable, of something that isn't even human, but it then becomes a real question of, yeah, what is your responsibility to another person, and why do people behave in certain ways, you know, and the opposition of two wills, and he's very good at showing someone faced with no hope, and how do people react to that. And it's interesting, the three different soldiers' reactions to it. It ends up becoming quite a philosophical film, quite an existential film as to what does it mean to live, what is the value of it. And I think he is continually fascinated by that question. I guess that's a question of Clockwork Orange and 2001, and I think even Dr. Strangelove, just what is it to live? I think Paths of Glory probably isn't seen as a terribly humorous film, especially compared to Dr. Strangelove, but there is an absurdity in Moreau when he's going through the trenches and saying to various soldiers ready to kill more Germans, and there's something very mechanical about his patter, which is the same regardless of who he's speaking to, his somewhat phony laugh, and I guess a kind of comic rule of three, of just meeting these three soldiers, and at the end you seeing someone who has shell shock, and just the absurdity of him saying it doesn't exist, slapping a man who just is unable to take in what he's saying, and that this patter really, when confronted with reality, when confronted with someone's real fear, just can't let it in. His only response can just be more violence and then getting rid of that person, which is a microcosm of what happens later. He just says, we have to take this anthill, and there is no way to say you can't, despite the fact that the first scene was his immediately saying it was impossible himself. And it becomes this awful mechanistic act of self-hypnosis war, which I think, as grim as it is funny. And I think Kubrick had this black view of things that sort of allowed for him obviously to be incredibly intelligent and insightful, but also allows for the idea of, well, where does it get you? All of this insight, you may as well be a simpleton for all of the impact you're having. It's almost worse to be insightful, because then you can see how horrible it is, that maybe it's better to be these generals with their convictions, and they seem to be living very pleasantly in their delusion, and the worst thing is to have your delusions taken from you. And you see, I think in Kubrick films, people holding on to their delusions very tightly, and how hard it is to rid yourself of delusion. And I think most comic characters are deluded, and so I think there's always a humorous element in his films, and he's very good verbally and very good at the banality of language and the repetition of stock phrases which become divorced from their meanings, as if, you know, killing some Germans is like a fun, peppy thing to do. It's completely inhumane. And so, yes, I do think it has moments of humour and real absurdity, like the soldier who's condemned at the end, saying, "Do you realise I haven't had one sexual thought since I was about to be executed?" It's just such a strange and unexpected moment that it is funny but awful at the same time. And he loves banality in language. I think Lynch has the same ability of, and I think there's something about cliched language which makes you realise that the character is lying to themselves, because they're not searching for something authentic. They're happy to play a role, and they're happy to use the cloak of language that is acceptable to other people. And so that creates a tension immediately. Someone using a cliche creates a dissonance, because either they know it's familiar and they're happy to go along with it, or they haven't reached a point of self-awareness yet where they realise that this is rote. And so you start, I think, unconsciously going, well, this is going to break down at some point. This person is going to come apart because they don't know themselves. And then you just see that person being tested in the film, and those assumptions are going to meet the highest form of resistance. And so he manages to create scenes which in anyone else's hands would be exposition, and someone would try and almost sugar them and make the exposition seem interesting, or cover them with jokes, or make them feel like they were going faster, whereas he does the opposite. He'll slow down an exposition scene, make it more banal, more on the nose, more stated, and it almost makes you lean in and just go, this is not going to end well, is it? I think I remember a quote from him, which is that no one making a film or engaged in an artistic enterprise really has something to say, that they have a feeling that they can't express by other means, and a sense of an enjoyment of that particular medium, whether it's paint and they just like that feel, or they just like the feel of film. And they have a sense, and that by making the thing and by investigating it fully, maybe what you thought may come out, but no one really sets out with a message and then tries to convey it, because that's propaganda, regardless of what it's propaganda for, and always boring, because it's so complex that it cannot be marshalled. All you can try and do is really probably hope that you're looking into something in an interesting way. That's probably the most a film can do.